Welcome back, everyone. My name is Rogers Orock from Lafayette College in Eastern here in Pennsylvania. It's a delightful opportunity to be back here. Not too long ago, I was here as a guest speaker, and I hope that we are going to have a productive conversation like the sessions we had in the morning. So this panel is entitled Precarity, Social Suffering, and Future Making. We have four presentations. The first will be by Kevan Harris from UCLA, titled The Hidden Injuries of Sanctions, Categorical Erosion and Recognition Ruptures in Contemporary Iran. Each speaker has about 15 minutes to speak, and then we'll gather the questions for each, like we did in the morning, for each presentation at the end of the presentations. So Kevan, up to you.
Okay, good afternoon. Got my timer here. I want to thank the organizers of this conference for their invitation. It's good to see some old friends here and a very esteemed panel. So I appreciate my colleagues and I'm looking forward to hearing what they have to say. I took this conference call as an opportunity to think through a burgeoning literature about kind of everyday journalistic work as well as scholarly work on the effects of international economic sanctions on the society of the Islamic Republic of Iran. I had formerly written a book, well, I still have written a book, on what now seems to be the good old days of the post-revolutionary order in Iran, where 2 decades of state expansion fostered the rising of new social classes, many of which saw themselves in opposition to the state and took part in democratic, feminist movements against the state, and really peaking in 2009, which is when my book ended. Since then, we've seen a reversal in many of these processes, and I wanted to, take the opportunity to think through them using some sociological concepts that are often used in, more wealthy countries, but not often used in zones of precarity in the global South. And we don't just have scholarly work, but we have, of course, lots of films and cultural production about life under sanctions in Iran, produced by, maybe not so ironically, the still thriving, in some ways, the film sector in Iran. The revolution actually saved the film sector in Iran, unlike a place like Egypt. And now Iran produces many films every year, including films which are critical of the state and endure repression by state cultural censors. One of which is a 2022 film called Layla's Brothers. And it's directed by Saeed Rustai. And it's an epic kind of film about a family, middle class, lower middle class family, and focuses on Layla, who's a woman in her 40s that works at a factory, and also is trying to help her 4 unemployed brothers establish some sort of financial stability. They live in Tehran, and the film continually acknowledges the pressure that they feel, attributing it to a wide sources of blame, including economic sanctions, government corruption, and kinship social structure at the same time. Their father, who's a kind of patriarch, although a diminutive one, essentially has been hoarding money throughout the film to buy his way into a larger extended family clan to show that he has the money and honor, and he's gonna have to take this money that he's been hoarding and give it to the other family to establish that he himself is financially stable. The daughter, Layla, does not know this and discovers in the middle of the film that the father has essentially been secretly hoarding gold coins, which people in Iran buy as a store of value in a highly inflationary economy. So she wants to use this money instead to help one of her brothers open a shop. And this creates essentially the drama of the film as these different tensions are pulled at. And every brother of Layla's brothers reacts to this kind of precarity situation through different mechanisms, through kind of semi-legal currency trading schemes. Another brother is in prison for passing false checks, common occurrence in Iran. And meanwhile, throughout the whole film, Layla, played by a very famous Iranian actress, Taina Ali Dusti, she kind of shoulders the burden of these pressures by diminishing. She realizes diminishing her own prospects for female independence as well as marriage, into a stable family. The film itself, by the way, just as an aside, ended up itself as a zone of struggle and politics. It got shown in Cannes. The government of Iran then denounced it and said it won't be shown in Iran. Meanwhile, one of the actors in the film denounced some of the actors for sexual harassment, and it became also a site where the burgeoning Iran's version of Me Too movement became a site where many women made claims similar to the actresses in the film. So this is not just this film. I mean, Iranian films often portray social realism in its own tradition, but there's also all kinds of journalistic accounts, scholarly accounts, popular accounts of life under sanctions, in which the blame is attributed to all kinds of actors. In fact, there's a whole popular debate about who's really causing all these problems we're experiencing. Is it the government? Is it the US? Is it the global economy, et cetera? And in fact, that confusion is a site of struggle. As with many cases where we have long processes of relative deprivation in many ways, some people are absolutely declining in their material life, but others see other parts of the world rise while they maintain stagnation. It creates all sorts of confusion about what's going on and how to understand it and reactions. And I just want to take a couple of minutes, by the way, as my version of the blame is to understand that, I think the best concept to understand how Iran is able to be subjected to the most extreme sanctions in the history of the world economy is through a concept that Henry Farrell, is a political scientist over at Johns Hopkins, called weaponized interdependence. The fact that the United States and the global economy are interdependent, and the United States is a key actor and node in many of the global processes on which the post-war world economy is built, means that whoever's in charge of the United States can weaponize interdependence for particular policy goals. In the Obama administration, when these sanctions were ratcheted up in 2010, they can be justified in terms of humanitarian or liberal internationalist ideas. And that's how they've been justified since. Of course, we can see, if you read the news last 2 days, when weaponized interdependence ends up in the hands of somebody else, a different type of state, with different types of policy goals, we can see the impacts of this form another way. Nevertheless, that's the macro historical context for the everyday realities that Iranians face. So I want to move into the constraints that we can see. I've read a lot of stuff now. It's been produced the last 5-6 years. I think empirically it's very interesting. I have many friends in Iran that I stay in touch with and listen to them about what they've struggled with. Conceptually, I would say that we still need to work through this. And in fact, that's why I think this conference is a very productive place. So there's 3 writers and theorists who I've seen their terminology used in the past for, understanding everyday struggles, but I've never seen them really used actually in the Middle East at all, much less on Iran. And one is Richard Sennett. Richard Sennett is not a Marxist, but he was a kind of humanistic approach to class analysis in the 1970s, continued to write for many decades, and his most famous book is called The Hidden Injuries of Class. That's where I get the title from. And in many ways, we can think about this as a starting point of how, sanctions as a way of disrupting economic life, just as class relations themselves can affect someone's sense of self-worth and dignity. And the stability that one might have had affects their, turning into rupture, affects their ability to provide their life narrative coherence. You can continue in the social rituals of everyday life. We just had Persian New Year a couple of weeks ago, but the ability to narrate a sense of life course continually gets blocked. And Sennett, through all these interviews with workers in his book, talks about how this creates a corrosion of character. The fact that people's identities, which are tied often through their occupation or their social position, continually frayed. So they're unable to narrate to themselves the stability that they see projected elsewhere. So, we have obviously lots of anthropological work on what happens when people can't fulfill the roles that society gives them, whether they're professionals or petty bourgeoisie in the middle class or occupational workers or care workers. Almost all of, I would say a vast majority of Iran's women are out of the labor force involved in unpaid care work. So I think, paying attention to conceptualizing a lot of what we see coming out of Iran, and I would imagine now that we're probably entering into a global recession again, many other parts of the world, it might be useful to help to conceptualize the struggles as partly of dealing with the fact that social roles and social structures are under strain and under collapse in many ways. The next person I want to talk about is Michel Lamont, who's a Quebecois sociologist who's most famous for working on how different working classes across Europe and the United States think about their moral worth differently. So moral worth is not just automatically coming from the fact you're a worker, but based on a kind of cultural schema that you are embedded in. And she talks about how workers engage in she calls it boundary work. They actually try to transform the boundaries of where moral worth is assigned. So when economies change, when neoliberalism reduces the stability of the working class, workers themselves start, they themselves then change the categories. They have power, at least over the discursive categories that they use to describe themselves. Nevertheless, this hits reality, and Lamont talks about the gaps in recognition. We know most of us probably familiar with the concept of struggles over recognition. And Lamont takes this and states how, on the one hand, an individual, of course, can work very hard and try to justify changing their life and say, I'm worth something, recognize me, whereas someone else says, no, you're not. And there's a gap in recognition, which creates all kind of strain that she shows in her ethnographic work. And finally, I want to talk about my colleague, Rogers Brubaker at UCLA, who's written quite a bit about race, ethnicity, nationalism, and many classification categories. But his main contribution is that, a main side of social struggle is not necessarily struggle over material resources in and of themselves, but struggles over the classifications themselves. Because as we know, classifications have material consequences. I don't have to tell this audience that. So classifications are contested terrain. They don't just describe, but they, classifications act upon the world. So we actually have all kinds of examples in Iran of people struggling over classifications. Who's middle class? Who's a worker? Who's a citizen? Who's a Muslim? These have changed, actually. In fact, pretending to be, given that working class culture in Iran has largely disappeared, like it has in most parts of the world, we don't have autonomous working class culture. In the kind of E.P. Thompson sense, most people convinced themselves that they were middle class. In fact, in surveys that I've run in Iran, 80% of the country says that they're middle class. And that's, by the way, the case in most middle income countries. If you look at South Africa, we have similar data. 75% of people say they're middle class, even in economic strife. So there's these major conflicts between what people believe they are and the changing forms of social structures around them. So let me return to Iran and look at, briefly how people react to them. And sometimes you can find pattern responses. Actually, the film itself is basically a study in how different individuals respond to this kind of constraints. And on the one hand, you find people using any transnational connections they have at all as a claim to status, or if they can get any resources from, trans-border connections, they'll use these either as economic or as cultural capital to say that I'm different than somebody else. Middle class or lower middle class families in Iran that see themselves as traditional, they see themselves as conservative, they overinvest then in religious practices, but also any type of credentials that the society still recognizes as valid. So educational credentials and conservative credentials and authenticity in cultural production. But I think it's also on women themselves, which is very interesting in many ways. After 45 years of almost universal education, where like in many middle income countries, more women go to tertiary education than men. in Iran. And yet, given that there's such low female participation in the workforce for a whole variety of reasons, the burdens on women are doubly or triply compounded in this period of kind of long stagnation. On the one hand, there's all kinds of new claims for why women should have authority in both everyday and larger decision-making processes. On the other hand, this kind of return of the patriarchal form is apparent in almost all aspects of life. And when you don't have access to economic resources, it really makes it less tenable. I would say overall, the best concept here is that not only is there consistent boundary work, if you look on how Iranians talk about themselves and talk about how they're able to maintain some aspects of what they consider normalcy under daily life, they're also engaging in all kinds of boundary work, we can call it, from Lamont, about how they claim that they're maintaining dignity and in some cases asking for recognition. And here we can also see, I should not elide the massive political struggles in Iran over the last 5 to 7 years, which are still hard to understand probably from the outside. But in many ways, we can see claims among activists in these movements, although they're not universal, for terms such as normalcy. So instead of wanting revolution, although some people want that, other people want normalcy. They want a normal revolution or a revolution for normalcy, depending on who you ask. What you can see here, like in many of the uprisings around the Middle East in the last 15 years, is actually the lack of coherent ideology and terminology for social transformation, but instead, I think concepts that bubble up through the struggles for everyday life and the struggles of precarity. So let me wrap up by saying that while it's often been conceptualized that sanctions are a form of economic warfare, this is warfare by economic means. And in many ways, that's what the US government has acknowledged often. Well, sanctions, in a message, is a trigger on an economy, especially a middle-income economy where there have been rising social classes for a long period of time, is a form of recognition warfare. It destroys or it reorders the categories of status and worth that individuals had built up and attempted to stabilize, if not jump over, or hope to jump over in their daily activities. So as much as many of us, including when I used to travel to Iran amid sanctions, see, well, on the one hand, people seem to be poor, but on the other hand, a lot of things seem the same. It was always a big paradox. And trying to deal with this paradox, I think one of the ways of dealing with it is that the continuities in everyday life that one sees often can mask the disruptions in categories and the changing transformations in worth and dignity and belonging and the contestations, and at least according to the movie, extremely stress-inducing contestations that occur if one doesn't pay attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevan. Our second presentation comes from Franco Banchiesi from Ohio State University on bounded sovereignty, precarity, blackness, and the rhetoric of African resilience.
Thank you.
First, I would like to thank Organizational just about the one sorry. And you will go to organize this very timely conference. Mass death at the Bothelsfontein gold mine in Stilfontein, South Africa, totaling 87 casualties among the hundreds of Zama diggers besieged underground from August 2024 to January 2025 by police cutting off food supplies and essential care was the result, that mass death, of a deliberate attempt by authorities to smoke out, as a minister put it, those illegal miners. Down shaft 10 and 11, formerly deactivated for more than a decade, South Africa's post-apartheid government claimed to fight what Minister of Minerals and Energy Gwede Mantashe called a war on the economy, quote unquote. The resonance with invasion rather than, say, civil war in the minister's bellicose image was secured by frightened public perceptions greatly amplified by the media of the Zama-Zama's alienness and possible recruitment by organized criminality. In an early testimony in preparation of a case before the Constitutional Court, Clement Molezzi, one of the miners emerging sickly and emaciated, spoke of the horror as a, and I quote, a testament to the cruelty of neglect and the resilience of those who fought to survive despite impossible odds, unquote. Once again, as with the Marikana massacre of 2012 in the same South African province, or the ongoing incorporation of so-called artisanal miners in the lethal economies of the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, languages and practices of annihilation and survival bounded the field, commodity-producing labor for international markets, upon which post-colonial African sovereignty had been heavily invested with hopes of stability, prosperity, and human dignity. In South Africa, the contrast between expectation and experience was especially stark. The unionization of black mine workers in the 1980s, whose leaders were, in a tragic irony, Mantashe and current minister Mantashe, the guy of the, we have to smoke them out, no, the guy of the economic war, and current President Cyril Ramaphosa, they were the leaders of that movement. That movement of black mine workers was a decisive turn in the struggle against apartheid. More than that, organized mobilization in the mines quintessentially symbolized the redemption within the very foundation of extractivist capitalism of wage labor, once the vehicle of immeasurable exploitation, precarity, and mortality for racially subjugated African workers, now a promise of democratic citizenship and social redress. The destabilization of black lives expected to aspire to employment as the imaginary condition of rights-carrying, dignity-fulfilling existence mirrored, on the other end, evolving strategies by a range of actors seeking stability in productive status. In fact, propelling artisanal mining is the vertiginous rise in international gold prices, which, just passing for the first time the symbolic threshold of $3,000 an ounce, have multiplied by more than 10 since the beginning of the century. As American global power has increasingly relied on punitive deployments, sanctions, and tariffs of the dollar's imperial privileges, emerging players like the BRICS+ countries now debating the adoption of a common currency unit envisage de-dollarization, therefore a new gold rush, as a path to financial stabilization. But also the stability of the global North's citizen worker, increasingly racialized by Western public discourse conflating immigration, illegality, and the dilution of cultural values, is presented in the so far successful fascist or fascistisant electoral calculus as a trade-off between allegedly unsustainable earlier welfarist compacts, themselves established through histories of colonialism, and the forced removal, containment, or disposal of black and blackened populations. Black radical critique of the racial as a descriptor not of identity, but of power-laden structural positioning, for example, in the work of Denisa Ferreira da Silva, designates as black and blackened not merely racialized others, but those who are caught, respectively, permanently and contingently in the horizon of death, da Silva calls it, where utter fungibility and extinction of black life are assumed and inconspicuous, even when, in fact, especially when, shocking and spectacular. It is the zone of indistinction and non-being that exists in the paradigmatic rather than historical time that Saidiya Hartman and Christina Sharp analyze as the afterlife, or respectively the wake of enslavement. One of Sharp's definition of wake is black enslavement's ongoing disaster for black lives, a globalized pattern of utter vulnerability that in Haiti as Lampedusa or New Orleans, and today one could add the Congo or Springfield, Ohio, is either downplayed by civil society or metabolized as humanitarian crisis, an opportunity to reinforce the West's moral pretenses rather than an ethical crisis, shaking the West's imaginary foundations. It is a perspective on instability that significantly departs from others more popular in critical conversations. For example, Naomi Klein's shock doctrine, in which devastating as they surely are, socioeconomic and environmental shocks must be eventful rather than ongoing. They are grasped as deliberate interventions and processes underpinning the accumulation logic Klein terms disaster capitalism. In sharp, instead, the ongoingness of Black catastrophe becomes inconspicuous because, usable as it is to multiple anti-Black purposes, it can leave everything else, economies, institutions, built environments, more or less intact, thereby making anti-Black violence less urgent a concern for those who are not Black. The historical processes grounding the viability of South Africa's gold mining industry in Black hyperexploitation and lethality are massively documented. Less attention has been paid to the underlying paradigm, which is at the core of my current research, positioning under white rule the notion of the native laborer in antagonism to African Blackness. To become laborers, and Blacks could only be laborers, not workers or employees, even legally, meant for African mine workers to access limited recognition as persons, limited to the extent person who was the promised recompense for achieving a civilized status measured in terms of orientation to work, discipline, family, and ambition mediated by quote-unquote artificial wants, a conditional and limited status that was in fact a permanent condition of blameworthiness, in other words, always liable to be accused of failing the civilization test. To be proper native laborers in their gendered household surroundings, Africans were expected to visibly separate themselves from the purely instinctual, stagnant, pre-linguistic, pre-symbolic, ahistorical void evoked by Blackness. In racial slavery's global and not just Atlantic wake, Blackness stood as the name of an essential antagonism vis-à-vis the human, a position that, differently from asymmetric and hierarchical discursive modes like stereotype and mimicry applied by post-colonial theory to the colonized subaltern, is not admitted to cultural mediation, therefore to the possibility of counter-signification. Saidiya Hartman uses the expression the burdened individuality of freedom to designate the persistence of Black captivity in the Western Hemisphere beyond what she calls the non-event of the slave's emancipation. To modern liberalism, abolition was nonetheless foundational as it grappled with the question of aligning in non-coercive ways, specifically Black subjection, with putatively universal human imperatives. Economic compulsion, a term popularized by white rule in the passage from abolition to African colonization, or the gentle stimulant of economic laws, as Cecil Rhodes called it, squared that circle by providing the question, will Blacks work without coercion, an answer compatible with the subjective conducts grounded in political economy that liberalism sought to globalize. The reduction of Black freedom to the labor contract and attendant gender proprieties and personal responsibility placed on the Black household the burden of proof for being worthy of admission into humanity. A new language of patience and endurance tried to translate burden individuality into actual capacity and initiative. Social scientists have now elaborated that language into resilience. In its earlier origins in the physical sciences, resilience, and there was a very interesting issue of the American Historical Review on the genealogy of the concept lately. Resilience meant absorption and bouncing back toward the reconstitution of something's original properties. The later incorporation of resilience in the study of social and environmental processes signified absorption of a shock as a step toward no longer just reconstitution, but adaptation as a human capacity. bouncing back stronger, so to speak. In a more normative and hopeful view, adaptation means fortitude that does not merely stand in the face of adversity, but also determines outcomes that exceed expectations, bouncing back better, so to speak. Resilience borders here on agency or conscious elaborations that, in terms of Reinhard Koselleck's conceptual history approach, make crisis resourceful and productive as the moment of contested, debated, yet undifferable decisions. It is precisely the effective economy that anchors resilience to hope or progress that is questioned by Stilfontaine's horrors or the reflections by Black theorists like Hartman and Sharp on the disposability of post-slavery Black lives, whose human status is conditional at best. In question are the very capacities alluded to by resilience as a value, when the expected outcome of social processes and institutional machinations is death. Translated into mere survival, adaptation is then pulled back toward its conservative origins as a concept, belying its critical ambitions of turning disruptive caesura into possibilities. Blackness, once promised emancipation from social death through free, i.e. waged labor, remains marked for actual death at the core of global capitalism. Clement Moelezzi, quoted above, testified that it was the police's intention to exterminate the Zama-Zama underground. Organized labor's repertoire of resistance arising from workers' precarity, literally as absolute and unmitigated dependence on capital, have limited purchase here. For dependence, even when extreme, is nonetheless a relational category, while direct violence is not, terror is not. Moelezzi's reference to resilience in defining Black response to that violence is then more analytically satisfactory than resistance, but at the cost of centering mere biological survival or the fact that only 87 died out of thousands. In the passage from post-colonial African state building to structural adjustment and liberalization, new sovereign states' creditworthiness was made to depend on patterns of subordinate insertion in world markets, which crucially verged on populations' productive discipline, economic enterprise, and diffusing radical political claims. Resilience as patience, endurance of hardship, and national compliance with externally imposed conditionalities was the register fusing the macro level of African states' burdened sovereignty with, at the micro, the very same burdened individuality that Hartman had identified as the condition of Black access to a travestied freedom. The growing popularity of resilience in African studies did indeed contest the assumption that African societies or individuals lack agency within such machinations, maintaining instead creative solutions drawing from cultural and material practices, reaching back into pre or non-colonial very long duration. Rescuing agency through resilience can also evade, however, the ways in which African resilience itself, as a framing of racialized notions of unique Black propensity to endure pain, hardship, and distress, is integral to another long duration. The long duration of the colonization of Africa as a Western project in the wake of slave abolition. Colonial emphasis on African presumed deep-seated cultural disposition to self-help and community development were routinely used to deny, constrain, or postpone social provisions and claims to equal citizenship. Resilience, thus understood, was also in the context of post-colonial structural adjustment, the collateral African authoritarian states offered to international donors while slashing the most basic social protection and repressing labor or social movements. Brenda Chalfin writes of sovereign availability in describing Africa's position in the grand experiment of late 20th century neoliberalism. It is a formulation implying an idea of relational, if highly unequal, negotiations that are historically contingent within, as Chalfin writes, the retooling of Bretton Woods agreements and institutions that had earlier delimited the possibilities of post-World War II political economy. Focusing on the contingencies of neoliberalism, a term that I don't like, by the way, we can talk about that, obscures, however, thus reproducing a long-standing problem in African studies dealings with global Blackness, the non-relational burdens on Black sovereignty, as much as Black individuality that Hartman writes about as obligations Blacks are expected to fulfill without consent or relationality, or the ontological debt attached to free and civilized status. I'm coming to a close. What ontology and contingency nonetheless converge upon is an intense desire, to which resilience discourse proves eminently suitable, to crowd out a more radical, possibly more chaotic blackness, to which Fanon, for example, anchored refusal of a sociogenic adaptation to a violently constructing world trying to pass as objective and normative. As a globally hegemonic discourse of the political, liberalism has approached blackness as the ultimate testing ground for the effectiveness of resilience as an injunction that ratifies domination in the guise of critique. Post-slavery and post-colonial blackness haunt liberal imagination with images of liberation that far exceed the terrains. Gender, class, nation, race itself, liberal governance accommodates within political economies of value and sovereignty. Exorcising such hauntings, resilience is then, in Fred Moten's and Stefano Harney's terms, a call to order. Resilience is a call to order through the solicitation of a subjective interest in personal or national sovereignty that augments the putative debt, metaphorical and actual, Africa's blackness is assumed to pay for its humanity, made conditional and revocable by what Sylvia Wynter calls the prevailing genre of the human. Burdened and bounded African and diasporic sovereignty reveals in the end a line of fracture. On one hand, sovereignty is the stake of political, social, and cultural strategies, including visions of indigenizing sovereignty by grounding in land resilient values and worldviews silenced by settler colonialism, but never actually lost, values that hinge on being resilient. On the other hand, anti-blackness as the afterlife of slavery points not at a loss of which sovereignty is the promise of recovery, but points to the unsovereign black positionality that Jared Sexton defines as the very loss of the dialectics of loss and recovery. The critique black unsovereignty calls for is a refusal not premised on a theory of resilient agency. The resilience praised in the Stilfontein Minor speaks in its intimacy with domination and violence to the ethical collapse of liberal democracy and capitalist employment as assumed material foundations of post-colonial sovereignty's ethical claims. Historians have been more interested in how African societies have contested rather than refused or eluded the wage relation and attendant modes of sovereign agency. Or else scholars have romanticized the informality of the poor as agency at a distance from the state. Left unanswered are then questions posed by black unsovereign, non-agentic waywardness, as Saidiya Hartman calls it, and popular practices of insubordination and impoliteness, as Basile Ngo calls them, as insurgent social poiesis. Thank you.
Wonderful. So we have Mikias Issei from Temple University, and then after that we'll have Lauren Landau. Mikias' talk is titled Conflict Induced Narratives and its Impact on Everyday Life, looking into Ethiopia's 2020-2022 Civil War.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So this is part of a study that I'm still working on, and just to give you a bit of highlights. Narratives is everyday life. The narratives are the stories we tell. Ever since this morning, we have been hearing so many narratives, and all those shape our mind without us knowing it, and as a result of which we act accordingly. So these narratives, when they're done deliberately, it also have a different perspective that puts in people's mind. If you may recall, in 2020, 2022, there was civil war in Ethiopia that was really severe, and that happened between the regional administration Tigray and the central government. Just to give you a little bit of background on that, the regional administration that has been the central government was hosted by structural adjustment of the party itself. And once they lost the power, they went to that area, and the struggle for power started over there. Immediately after that, they were bad-mouthing each other in different ways, and as a result of which war happened on 3rd and 4th November of the 2020. The Ethiopia's recent conflict, particularly the Tigray War and its spillover to the region in Amhara, have left deep social fracture while military actions have dominated headlines. The role of the media narratives and hate speech exacerbating divisions not to be overlooked, particularly the social media. My interest here is the social media because bad-mouthing or all kinds of narratives has always been there in all kinds of forms, but the happening of the social media has exacerbated it. So Ethiopia, I've given you the background, where it is, everybody knows. That said, the 2 years war ended with peace deal in October 2020, signed between the two warring parties in South Africa. That's a relief for everybody, but that was not the end of the war, because the narrative has already created division among people. People were not able to do their regular job. Farmers were not able to farm. Professors, many university professors were unable to collect their salaries. As a result, ended up being, sorry to say that, beggars and on the street, living on the street, and some others fleeing their regions. And that animosity has created some kind of sore feeling between different sects of the society. So in this regard, a week into the conflict, the BBC has come up with an interesting publication that says the use of social media has really affected the country, and it's going to dismantle so many of the social fabrics that have always been there. If you could see it here, Ethiopia Fact Check has brought out activists, 52% of the false information that was narrated on the media were from activists, 22% from the government itself, 19 journalists, and opposition groups 7%. And the list goes on. And as a result, people have created that boundary of us and them, and as a result of which the othering has been going on for a long period of time. Just to give you a quick glimpse of what, as a result, the structural exercise of that created narrative, the prime minister, the current prime minister of the government itself, has named those TPLF people as the cancer of the country or an invasive weed, whereas the party was referring his government and himself as the enemy of the Tigray people and satanic, or the prime minister referring them again as junta. Junta here, it's not the basic English term. It is highly loaded when it is translated into the local language. It means warmongers who want to leave the country with arms, and referring them as because they came to power through armed struggle for 70 years in 1991, they want to go back and do the same thing again. And he called them scavengers. And the TPLF said, no matter what, we would want to break this country apart so that we have our life. There is this sentiment of weaponizing the information. For example, if you could see here, this happened, there was an airplane crash, the Ethiopian Airlines crash in March 2020. This body was exhibited as that has happened in Tigray as new thing, which is a false one. That's quoted by the BBC. This is from Darfur, that is represented as that has happened in Tigray. This is taken from Russia and represented as the Ethiopian government using such sophisticated missile on Tigray. The list goes on. So the social media platform became battlefields for factions to disseminate such information, be it the government or the regional ones. These partisan media outlets aligned with ethnic factions further entrench divisions. Amara Media Corporation, the country has established its own ethno-linguistic part of regional administration, whereby each of them have their own media houses. So the Amhara doing some wrong or bad mouthing the Tigray, and the Tigray the Amharas, and that crisscross goes all over the place. And international outlets in this process, like the BBC, Al Jazeera, over reduced Ethiopia's complex conflict into Tigray versus Abiy, as if there is no nuance at all, and there is no how it has happened, because there was some kind of 4 or 5 years of animosity that has ousted the TPLF out of power. That has all been forgotten and reduced to Abiy versus TPLF, which is wrong narratives. As a result of which, people have started to pick that up and use that line to hate one another, and roads were blocked for people not to be able to trade among one another, which used to trade, or churches that they have been to go together have been have started to align themselves in a certain way. And that didn't end in the country alone. Even in the diaspora, the church and the mosque that Ethiopians go to say, this is for this ethnic group, this is for that ethnic group, and that thing goes back all the way, feeding all the way to the social media that goes into the public. And in the social media area, one must take note of the introduction of the Ethiopian alphabet, which is the Giz alphabet, in which the Amharic, the Tigrinya, and other languages are written, are being used in the social media, which the social media sentiment can't figure out what they are saying. So Facebook has been accused of perpetuating such kind of dehumanization, also mass atrocities as facilitator. And even was it yesterday or before yesterday, it's being sued in the Kenyan court as well for that exercise. So I would say the social media was really engaged in escalating the conflict. The loss of life was, uncountable. Just to give you an example, on the 9th and 10th November 2020, alone in 24 hours, more than 200 ethnic Amaras were massacred by a group called Samri from the Tigray region in the contested area called Walqait Tagade or Tagade, whichever side you want to speak about it. That's documented by the OHCHR. The OHCHR again reported the Amara people being affected of that, went on and attacked the Tigray people again. So the tit for tat thing keeps going, and that narratives that has really changed, that has broken the trust, has been at a foreplay whereby these people were inflicting harms on one another. The widening of the identity rift since the introduction of the 1991, EPRDF come to power, and the new constitution that has ethno-linguistic constitutional background. So there is some kind of misunderstanding between people. Those who love one federal state whereby there is no ethnic groups, and the others for the ethnic groups. So that has created some kind of rift for some being privileged, for others not. That has been widened due to the rift, and as a result was undermining the trust, manipulation, that caused the manipulation of information to erode trust, reliable news sources and institutions. Partisan media outlets were alleged to ethnic factions, further entrench divisions. And so what was the narrative impact? People were internally displaced. For example, in Tigray alone, 2 million people have been displaced, fleeing the violence, looting, targeting attacks, displacement led to abandoned farmlands, disrupted livelihoods, and overcrowded IDP camps lacking basic services. Also, community trauma. The community trauma reports documented mass killings, sexual violence, destruction of cultural and religious sites, deepening ethnic tensions and societal fractures. The looting and the destruction of public and private assets, including hospitals, schools, and banks, have left people with nothing. Where the people who have even money in the bank, they can't use it. Kids were put out of school, and cultivation of lands were unable, and the destruction of infrastructure has really affected the society. So what's this? So what? You know, this is nothing new for Ethiopia alone. It's been happening all over the world. Well, what's new here is such narrative spread in hate speech, for example, the Rohingya or from Rwanda genocide to the latest Ethiopian massacre that has happened. But the widespread reach of social media has enabled the rapid spread of uncontrolled hate speech, necessitating establishing a comprehensive system to prevent such atrocities. And my research emphasizes the need to take into account the role of social media in conflict prevention and peace building strategies, considering the specific context and utilized. Combating identity-based conflicts essentializes legislative tools and regulations that oversee information creation, production, and distribution, both from business standpoint and human rights protection. So post-conflict, the war didn't just kill people. Like I said earlier, it killed trust. So while the Pretoria ceasefire in November 2022 stopped the fighting, the societal fracture remained. There are some kind of exercises that are happening in Wollo, in the Amhara region and others, where they want to do peace and reconciliation processes. But that's not enough. More has to be done. Particularly, the media didn't just report divisions, it shaped them. Therefore, it will have to shape again the healing process. It must include the new media spearheading the narrative. The recommendations that I have is for everyday life, post-conflict recovery requires more reform like that of South Africa, whereby post-apartheid, the SABC model. Regulation of social media is critical because the nuance, the algorithms and everything don't take it seriously of the rest of the countries. Actually, this has been reported many times, but nobody is listening and taking action accordingly. Fact-checking is supposed to be there. International outlets must avoid oversimplifying and also elevating elevating the same voices of peace builders. You know, the peace builders are always in the spiral of silence, you know, as they are at the bottom of the spiral of silence. When the majority vocals say this, that, and the other, everybody takes that up, whereas the same voices always are overshadowed. So those are supposed to be brought up. And the future research to this end is supposed to look into conflict narratives in all mediated communication to better understand the intertextuality between different culture and societies, to provide insight to understanding the problem and offer models that help detect and manage early. If we don't do that, from the experiences that we see in Ethiopia, now people are not to see eye to eye. Marriages have been broken due to this narratives, and people are not seeing one to the other. They are not going to the same market again. That has happened in a few period of time where that cultural fabric has been built for years and years. So to bring it back is not an easy thing, but it needs a concerted effort. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mikias. I think we now have the last presentation, which is titled "An Atlas of Uncertainty: Spatiotemporal Journeys into and Through African Cityscapes," by Caroline Wanjiku Kihato and Lauren Landau. I understand that Lauren will be presenting for both. So Lauren, so nice to see you again after so many years. And you have 15 minutes, and then after that, we'll take a collective round of questions. Can you?
Thank you, Rogers. I wish I could be there in person to see. Can you see the presentation? Is it coming through?
You'll have to share your screen, I think. We can see you, but not the presentation.
Okay, okay.
It's done.
Oh, okay. Great, we can see. Thank you.
Okay, let me begin with first thanks to Gayatri and other organizers for the invitation, and apologies from Caroline for a discussion of uncertainty and journeys. She's just encountered that. Her flight from Frankfurt to Johannesburg was delayed, so she is in the air right now. So you're stuck with me. Anyway, let me try to go quickly. I have a lot of pictures, and it's a project that is ongoing. So we're really looking forward to getting your feedback and your ideas. This is a project that really builds on the idea that urbanism and mobility is what shapes politics, it shapes citizenship. And we're engaging with many of the themes that you heard about from Malik and in that first panel this morning and have resurfaced throughout the day. Our main position is that the way in which Africa is urbanizing, and it's urbanizing faster than any other place, and you're going to have huge numbers of people living in these areas, looks very, very different from how we've seen urbanization take place elsewhere. And that is going to generate a very different understanding of citizenship that asks us to reconsider many of the ethical and epistemological tools that we use to make sense of politics. And I think we've heard about that a little bit this morning, about how uncertainty and how the choppy waters of politics is really shifting a lot about how we talk. And one of the things that we're really pushing is that this idea of precarity, the idea that somehow people feel uncertain because things aren't as they predicted, doesn't make sense anymore. In sense, the idea of progress, the idea of politics, the idea of predictability itself is being eroded to such a degree that uncertainty spatially, temporally, even socially, is so strong that it is going to generate a different politics that we don't even yet have a name for. And so the project that we are doing, which we're calling the Atlas of Uncertainty, is meant to be a kind of guide to this new politics. Not to say that this is what's going on, but to show us how we're getting here and help us start a process of developing some tools. And to make sense of it, to think about it, to unsettle how we see mobility, how we see urbanization, how we see citizenship. So let me just tell you a little bit about where we're coming from. And as I said, a lot of the conceptual, let's say, baggage or frameworks that we have about citizenship, especially how it deals with migration, diversity, people coming together, comes from these places. Maybe Philadelphia also counts in this, but the idea that lots of different people come together and they're bound by an economy, by a future that helps to create a sense of rights, a sense of claim, but also a sense that there is a common collective project in place. That this is where you're going to build through solidarities, whether it's unions, whether it's community organizations, etc., that you're building for your future and that you're building with your neighbors and that you're building in the place that you are. You might also be thinking about other spaces, but primarily what you're looking for is representation and influence where you are. This is Lefebvre, this is the right to the city. This is what we think of as modern citizenship, and it continues to inform a lot of the ideas that we heard this morning from Brazil or from Peru about what citizenship should look like at a normative level. What we're suggesting is that those processes that produced that kind of citizenship have a kind of temporal and geographic presumptions that no longer hold in the new urbanism, the new place where tens of million people are going to live in the years ahead. Why are we so excited about this? Why are we thinking that this is so important? Well, if you look at these sorts of statistics, that for every one new urban resident in Africa, you're going to have 8 new urban Africans, right? This is the future of cities. And if we think cities are where citizenship is generated, this will be the new future of citizenship, right? And just to give you an idea, this is kind of what it looks like, just to give you an idea of the scope. I don't know how large the screen is there, but you can see in the center there, this is what Accra, one of the 3 cities that we've been working in, looked like in 1991. And then you can see where it is in 2014. It has continued to expand at this kind of rate since then, right? Just the sheer size of this is extraordinary. What's happened, though, is you haven't seen an expansion of state services. You have not seen an expansion of jobs. What you see is an incredible expansion of uncertainty, of people living in what you might call a kind of do-it-yourself urbanism. You can see this again in Deep Slut, and some of you will know this, those of you who spent time in South Africa, right? If we went back 20 years, this place was a field. Literally 25 years ago was an empty field. It was designated as a place for temporary housing, and the government built some of this. And then over just 10 years, what you saw was this place exploding in terms of its population. It is a place filled with what Sheila Mbembe might call superfluous labor, people who are not needed in the city, people who don't have jobs, but who come from everywhere for the possibility of something, right? This is in the wealthiest country in sub-Saharan Africa, and yet you're looking at 40, 50, 60% unemployment rates in places like this. Most importantly, these are also places where the police don't exist. The police station came about 15 years after most of the people. The KFC got there a lot quicker than the police, and the police still don't go into most of these areas. These are places that are effectively self-regulated, and they're places where people are not from, and they may not want to be, right? And so what we're seeing is tens of millions of people living in informality, in spaces that are deeply unsettled, where their lives are highly multi-local, and they're not even sharing an idea of what the future should look like, or they're not building the solidarities to build a common future. It's not even clear that they have an idea together of what these places should look like, because for most of the people, they don't see their futures in the place where they are with the people that they live next to, right? And this is coming out of the research that we're doing in Johannesburg. It's coming out of the research that we've been doing in Kenya, in Nairobi, and the research that we've been doing in Accra, right? And you start to see that this is reconfiguring almost every aspect of human life. The whole idea of family, for example, is being changed. The idea of generations and how they relate. At one level, this could be enormously liberating. It creates freedom, a way to escape certain types of patriarchy, but it also suggests a kind of erosion in basic trust with your neighbor, basic trust with your family. The ways in which you relate are being reshaped. Some people are seeing that as an erosion. For others, it is increasingly becoming normal, that this is how we relate. This is what is to be expected. And you can start to see this in terms of how families are organized. This idea that the family lives together, that you make decisions where you are and you build up something together, is not holding for these people. This is coming out of our surveys, and you can start to see where people's families are. They're not living with them. They're living multi-locally, and importantly, often where recognition and real relationships the important relationships is not where they live most of their lives. Right? And so the idea of a place-based politics, that you're working in solidarity with your neighbors to improve where you are, is not what these people want. And in many instances, the idea that you get drawn into local politics is actually something negative, because it fixes you to a place that you don't necessarily want to be. There are some people who want that and others who don't, right? But what we're starting to see instead is people living in these multiple spaces and these multiple time frames together. Some just waiting, some looking to build, some looking to get out. And all of this, I think, is creating a different sort of way of relating to politics and a kind of normative view of what politics or solidarity should look like. Perhaps the most important actor in all of this is not the state anymore. It's certainly not the unions or the labor organizations, community organizations. In the surveys that we've done, almost no one is joining those things. And only about 20% of people think it's even important to participate in formal political processes. They have given up on what the state can provide. It is not their aspiration. Instead, they are turning, in many cases, to the miraculous. And we see this in this quote from Stella at the bottom. And the Pentecostal churches are about the only organization that has captured the imagination of people in these areas. That is in part because it offers a promise of something better when people can no longer see how you would get there by any other means. That solidarity, that unions, that organizing is not how you get ahead. People want to get better, they want better lives, but what they know no longer works, right? And this kind of uncertainty, this inability to get educated and live a better life is so normal that people are looking for other ways of getting ahead. Right? That can be in the place you are, it can be somewhere else, right? So this is again where people imagine living their lives in the next 5 or 10 years. And you can see that is often not where they are. So this has opened up a kind of way of seeing this space, which is not, we cannot yet name. We've been struggling to find the pattern of how people are organizing, how people are making their way in this space, and we're not able to do it yet. We've been doing surveys, we've been doing focus groups, we've been doing kind of ethnographic observations and the like. And what we see is a real diversity, a real heterogeneity, temporal, spatial, social, racial, ethnic. It doesn't fit one pattern. Malik this morning tried to offer us a kind of describe this in terms of Blackness, and maybe that is a way that brings it all together. But when we try to add content to what that Blackness means, it starts to become very difficult. It becomes very difficult to name. And that's part of why we're calling this project this Atlas of Uncertainty. It's a guide to this. And what we're asking you to do is like step away from the kind of Durkheimian or any of the sort of modernist ideas of what citizenship, what society looks like. Start to think about this in more relational terms, not just spatially, of course, but also temporally, socially, and elsewhere. And we've turned to sort of a kind of critical cartography and artists to try to help us see this. So we've engaged with using the social science data that we've got with a series of artists, and this is where I'll end, which is meant to evoke and to get us thinking about how these places look, how they are being produced, what sort of citizenship, what sort of precarity, what sort of uncertainty life is likely to be in the future. So I'm just going to end by showing you a few of these things. This is from the critical cartography of looking at people's journeys. And you can see here, each one of these is a separate person coming from someplace, maybe thinking of going back, but also living these different kind of lives across multiple futures and multiple possibilities, right? So these in one place, in many places, you're getting these diversity. This is why we don't see solidarity. This is why we don't see people joining together. But then we're getting, let's see if this works. All right, so I think you've seen a little bit there. This is one of the artists from Nairobi, right? Trying to capture what it is like to be in the city, where you are present, others are present, but you're almost like a specter moving through this space. You shape it as you move through, it shapes you, but you're not fully there, right? And this is a different way, I think, of engaging with space and producing space than we've fully theorized before. This is another one of our Ghanaian artists who's starting to try to conceptualize what family might look like. And her metaphor here is that of a school of fish, where you can kind of travel across space together, but you're never quite sure what direction anyone is going to go. And there's not a lot of sort of firm bounds that tie you one to another. Right. And here, this is from South Africa, Boitumelo, trying to think about how these different kind of histories and geographies, both above and below ground, past and future, intersect in these places, and try to speculate a little bit on where we might be going. Right. This is Wazile's kind of representation of Hillbrow that some of you will know. I'm just going to finish here, right? With this is from Ghana, where women have their names. Women from the north have their names and their village tattooed on their body in case they die in the city, so at least they can be returned home from where they've come, right? So just further images. What I'd like to do is just invite all of you, if you can make it. We have a book launch and an exhibit that will be in Johannesburg about a year from now. So we're still developing this project. We're still trying to think through what all of this means. And I look forward to the discussion that we'll have in the next few minutes and anytime after this if you want to reach out. Thank you.
Very much, Lauren. This was illuminating in many ways. I think it has been the norm that the chair of the panel begins with his or her own questions. I would like to not do that. I would like to, I have some, not questions, I'm not so sure what I have, but if there's room for me in the end, I would like to take that, but otherwise, I'd like to give the privilege to the audience. And so we'll take questions in rounds of 3. And so the first 3 people, please indicate with a show of hand and the microphone will come to you. Yes, Ali? Ellie? Helen?
Okay, thank you very much. I learned a lot from listening to all of you here, but I have a question that not to all of you, but just to one person. And that has something to do with with my friend here, with regard to the Ethiopian conflict and the examples which you just cited, and specifically with regard to the role of social media in this conflict. And I'm not sure, but like just whether you could see like that what we are seeing here today, it's not like just individuals like this who are just like making comments about the conflict or so, but the state itself is just like just benefiting. The warring parties are benefiting. So those who are involved in the conflict are not like just only the state and the other, not like just individuals themselves like that are being drawn into the state. And that's like just maybe similar to what we see like just in other places in which like just people who use this medium, they have like this very important like this power. Even we see it like this here today, like we did about this Laura Loomer here. What power she has in them. So that one thing which I just want to make want to see like to hear from you your opinion, because it just reminds me of what's going now in Sudan with regard to the role of the mass media. It's not like just people who are just talking and insulating and all the examples which you just cited about remaking and making all this kind of things like just only on this conflict in the Tigray, but like just going on now, okay? And they will just be celebrated by the government in this. Thank you.
Kelly and Helen.
Thank you for all your presentations. So you, a year ago, or maybe a little bit more, we had a former South African president here to speak, and he cited a poem by a South African. And in that poem, he said he had a phrase, the past, present, future as one word. Past, present, future is always with us. And I say that to say, and Kevin, you talked about contemporary Iran. Then you talked about you used the term post-colonial, and then you used the term post-conflict, and we're dealing with uncertainty. Isn't all of these things present because there's a failure for the people of the South to be able to define for themselves what their future looks like? So that they've never had that. So I'm not sure that this whole idea of a post world or even a contemporary world we have really grappled with the colonial world. Am I making sense?
Yeah.
So in that sense, the past, present, future is always with us. We still haven't grappled with that. And I wonder how in your work that you interrogate that, even when using these concepts of contemporary or post-conflict or post, how do you interrogate that? How do you deal with that?
And then Helen?
Thank you for that beautiful presentation. My first question goes to Nikias because I really identified with what you said. Because I'm from Cameroon, I'm from the English-speaking zone, and that's actually what is happening. There's currently a civil war going on in Cameroon, but nothing is said about it. However, all what they're doing is you have this media propaganda from the states and from the separatists, that's the Ambazonia Republic. Now, this is the question I have for you. What strategies can be used to counteract this divisive narrative and to promote national unity? That's for Nikias. Then my second question goes to Harris. It's true, we've been hearing a lot about Iran recently from the social media, but this is my question. How does female independence manifest in the face of cultural and political restriction in Iran? I don't know. The third one goes to Dr. Franco. I may be wrong. If I'm wrong, please correct me. I got the phrase you made mention of will Black work without cohesion? I don't know whether I got the phrase correctly. And the question, what I wanted to say, what does it suggest about the historical and present labor condition in South Africa? Thank you.
All right, let's take the three and then take a second round. So I think we'll go in the order in which they were asked, Nikias, and then Evan and Franco.
Thanks, Ali, for the question. Beautiful question. Well, the role of social media in conflict is now very well established and everybody knows it's being in discussion. However, what's not being discussed is who's using it and how is it being used. Oftentimes, we always speak about states and the warring parties or whatever, but there are oftentimes this information have two angles. One, people monetize these inflammatory speeches. So they don't care who's killed or who's hurt, but the money they make because of the likes or whatever, they make it as inflammatory as possible. However, there are also bots that are being used, be it by different kinds of forces. It is not only individuals, but also state organized, but it is, we know, we can see where it comes from, but it is difficult to pinpoint that it is you or the other person or this group or the other person, but you could easily see. We couldn't find the data how to trace it because the horizontal, democratic kind of exercise in social media is, you don't account to which this kind of narrative comes from. So it is so difficult, therefore it's kind of organized And to give you an example, in 2021, there was no more campaign on the Ethiopian case. It was social media hashtag no more that are pro-government, and there was hashtag now more from the TPLF side. These are, I have some information that some are paid, some are hired, some are individuals working for the government or the other party disguised as individuals or opinion leaders. But it is highly organized and reporting one another, saying inflammatory words and agitating people to do so much harm so that the division can continue because they make something out of it. For the warring parties, they want their control, they want to control perception. For the people who are doing that, they monetize and they make money out of it. So it is highly organized. Kelly mentioned that past, present, and future. It's important because if we don't look into the back, we can't go forward. So the interruption of civilization that we had left us outside of our consciousness, because that conscience that we have the mind map vis-a-vis the reality that we are living in now. The reality we are living in now is, particularly when we come to the political spectrum, which is more of Eurocentric and alliance itself were led by the elites, so to say. The people on the ground have their own wisdom and they know their history, and whenever they have conflict, they can manage on their own, and they know their past, how they live now, what to live for their future. However, the political leadership which is on top is really not letting that happen because the elites want to maintain its power. And the media propaganda Helen mentioned is what strategy can be devised to promote. It's not any different to what I said to Kelly, because one good example when we had civil conflict, before coming back to academia, I used to be a peace builder, peacemaker, UN diplomat in the Department of Peacekeeping Operations and Political Affairs Department. So in my travels, what I've seen, what works is what the culture on the ground is, as opposed to one size fits all that we decide at the Security Council level and we take it that nothing has worked. Particularly if you look into Cote d'Ivoire, during the civil war between Gbagbo and Ouattara, they were fighting with each other and with principle. The rule of engagement was not to destruct public properties, not to affect schools or anything, but they kill each other, their parties, not even people of outside of their parties. That kind of discipline is good, even if I don't support the killing with one another, when they can take it to the table, but still at least it's far better than, creating that divisive kind of mentality. So therefore, I would say looking into the tradition in which the society is built is quite important, and that's where the strategy must come from. Then for us who are, dressed like this and, in comfortable offices to solve this type of that, they know their problem, they know how to solve it. It is for us to learn from them than telling them that one size fits all. Thank you.
All right, thanks. May I quickly implore everybody, both people who ask in the next round of questions and speakers, to keep the talking short, because we have to leave here by 4:30. I understand we should stop by 4:30. And so let's hope you take the questions, and then we can get a round of round of questions. Franco?
Franco should go then first.
Yeah, I mean, the question, will blacks work without coercion was the big dilemma. In fact, it was the big nightmare for abolitionists immediately after the abolition of slavery in the Western Hemisphere, both in British Empire. And it was also a question that was, I think, immensely generative in a negative and horrifying sense for white thought and governance practices. And initially there was an unqualified yes as an answer. Yes, I mean, labor contracts are enough. And that was the answer of abolitionists, missionaries, evangelical Christians. More conservative opinions would say no, coercion is necessary. And therefore, I mean, forced labor in Africa as well. I think that the answer that in the end proved most enduring and most generative of political consequences is the answer that liberalism, for lack of a better word, liberalism in the classical sense of the word, provided to that question, which is to say, yes, but yes, Black will work without coercion, but something needs to be done to their affects, dispositions, and agency or resilience. In other words, something has to be extracted from Blackness so that the rest of Blackness can be condemned and left in a state of dereliction. What has to be extracted is what one would call economic acquisitiveness, consumption habits, positive orientations toward work and discipline, and most importantly, a disposition not to raise radical questions about one's structural positionalities, so to speak. The catch is that those conditions were never meant to be really fulfilled. I mean, they were completely open-ended. In fact, new conditions could be constantly added so that in a sense, it is precisely that kind of indeterminate open-endedness and uncertainty toward the achievement of civilizational status, something that is never meant to be achieved, but toward which one is always meant to tend or to aspire. That really lies the way in which liberalism has managed to combine within its global operations, so to speak, a universal notion of human conduct with very deeply racialized hierarchies.
Kevan?
I agree with that. So yeah, let me start with the past question about alternative future making alternatives, or maybe more like past making, I would say. I mean, if you think of the 1979 revolution in Iran is actually a very interesting case, which gets elided a lot of the time in post-colonial theory and in the historiography of the global South. I mean, if you take a look at the politics, the discourse, and the eschatology of the 1979 revolution in Iran, it proclaimed to remake all things under the sun. It wanted a true Islamic human. It brought concepts of Ummah versus the Millet. Ummah meaning a broader conception of humanity beyond the nation state. Of course, they didn't make that up. The concept was around, but also solidarity with third world struggles beyond the Islamic Kate world. In that sense, it was a liberation theology for Iran, but also for the region, and it has this similar to Latin American liberation theology. But when it actually hit the ground, two things happened. And they're actually very similar to what happened to the Bolshevik Revolution in some ways. There was an international state order which attempted to block off particular transformations of the region, and then there were uprisings from below that the state repressed within the first 3 years. And what ended up by the end of a 10-year war was a kind of, instead of Stalinism in one country, of Khomeiniism in one country, where we have a state promoting a single orthodoxy in all things, which sound discursively quite radical. But then everyone defines themselves either by adapting it for their own purposes, to move upwardly mobile or to gain resources, or they see liberation in the opposite of whatever that is. So unfortunately, the state provides the clay on which people project their futures. And that goes to the so to what extent is that inside or outside? People thought they were doing something completely new, as most revolutions contain that. Otherwise, what the hell's the point of it? But in many ways, there's also a cautionary reading, because Iran and Iranian intellectuals commonly portrayed themselves as being one of the Asian countries that was not formally colonized. Therefore, they had ties with the colonized world, but they all themselves consider themselves somewhere outside of it at times not. They had a difficult relationship with the concept itself. That turns to the feminine question, which, there was a large literature, which I think is largely died down, which saw that any activity by any woman that at all went outside of these state sanctioned spheres was categorized as resistance, agency, resilience, pick the keyword that we want to critique here. And therefore it was always seen as the opposite of whatever was going on. Whether the person agents themselves actually claimed as such, by the way, but often did. And this is where the intersection with, a word I also don't use all the time, neoliberalism matters, because consumption practices, self-presentation in the world, online, offline, desires of the future, too easily met with basically what the global norm was on that. It wasn't an attempt to carve out something opposite, and yet was celebrated. I would say celebrated by intellectuals inside of the country, and certainly by outside of the country as a sign of transformation. So I always, nevertheless, there's a huge, as all of us would know in our own respective countries, there's a huge heterogeneity of everyday life that the state can't even see, much less mobilize, much less actually repress. And the weaker states, or the unevenness of states, is often a boon. People who want to pursue alternative lifestyles or alternative everyday practices. And I would push back and say that they're always, and that's the space where I think we prefer to look at, because I would push back against the notion that we're always already, overdetermined by, and our behaviors and actions are always overdetermined by the past, the present, and these extremely abstract categorizations that have returned to intellectual discourse over the last 20 years, after a generation of deconstruction of those concepts.
All right, thank you all three. I want to ask if we are okay with using maybe 4 or 5 more minutes of our potential, because we're always now in the contingent, potential coffee break. If everyone is okay with that, I'll ask Gayatri to give the microphone to the next round of people who want.
All right, thank you very much. I think some of the questions I want to raise, we'll take them up during the coffee break. So because I find.
But remember that Lauren is not.
Oh, yes,
yeah.
I'll maybe let Lawrence respond.
Yeah.
And then because I find so many things so quite generative in many of these arguments that just thinking through some of it. Quickly for Kevan, the point about continuities masking disruption. Yeah, I was wondering if this is actually not why people are able to keep on keeping on, as they say, because of the possibility of that mask, or which makes it look as if we're continuing even when there's disruption. So I'm wondering whether you think it's so critical to our capacity to keep going on, so in every context, not beyond Iran. For Franco, I am wondering if I'm reading you well, or hearing you well. You seem to be implying that resiliency could be a form of social debt. And if I hear that very well, I find it really very true, but also disturbing in some contexts, because there is a sense in which resilience can constitute in thinking about the places in which I have done research. While we tend to glorify resilience, it can also be the greatest impediment to the possibility of transformation. So when you pose it as a form of social debt, I think that rings true, but at the same time, I find it also that it can be disturbing in the context of the project of social transformation. So I'm wondering how you respond to that. My final point is to Lauren. I'm wondering whether, and your project is fascinating, and you seem to pose the urban space as perhaps the primary space of possibility, and maybe also of impossibility in social life. And I'm thinking maybe now that I've lived for a while in the United States, the polarity between the urban and the rural, which seems to fit the kinds of challenges we are facing in the United States now in our politics. It's not that strong in most African contexts, but I think there is a way in which we see the urban as perhaps not just the primary, but the only place of possibility in what we call late capitalism. So I'm wondering whether you are reflecting on this in your project in terms of how, if we think of the urban as the only place of possibility, what is the implication of that for those who are also having to move back to rural, or who are connected in many ways, and they have very recent works that are quite fascinating in terms of the ways in which even those of us in the urban, and this is actually true in Africa and I think in Latin America, are connected to people in rural places because a substantial part of our income goes to those people. I'm ATM for some people in some places in Nigeria now, and then they just plug something in and they take money out. So there's a sense in which we must understand how we are connected even in our urban life and our shifting around urban spaces to those people who are not able to shift, and therefore our shifting is their own source of income. Thank you.
All right. Any other question? I think we can ask, even if the speakers may not be able to address, or they will take them with them to think. That's perhaps what is so useful about the last segment. If any other person wants to address a quick comment or question, they can do that. Otherwise, Lauren, you may begin.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for the question. I think part of what we're doing is actually trying to erode these categories of the rural and the urban, and even just the whole scale of politics. Most of the discussion in African politics is very much focused on the idea that the real politics is happening in the rural area, that's where people's associations are, that's where politicians gain their sort of foothold among their ethnic communities. And of course, that has had some truth in the past. But I think as we see the majority of Africans living in what would be called cities, that will become the generative space for politics. But in doing so, will also erode this whole idea of what is the urban and the rural, and what is any kind of place-based politics, as everybody is connected, not just between rural and urban, but between urban and Minnesota, or urban and where they imagine they will be somewhere else. And that we need to rescale, both temporally and geographically, how we understand what is generating our future politics. And those politics, I heard this continuity, people are developing a post-colonial politics. It's non-ideological. They're developing it by living it, by enacting it. And we don't yet have a name for what they're making. And I think that's part of the project that we're trying to do.
People want to comment on Wale's question?
Well, I mean, if I may,
Yes.
I think a distinction needs to be drawn between resilience as a practice. So I do that in the paper too. I mean, between resilience as practice and resilience as an injunction. I mean, as a practice, I wouldn't differ very much from many of the analyses that were proposed by Lauren or by Abdulmalik Shimon this morning. However, there is also the question that when those practices are performed, enacted by those who are Black, they also have to face the constant injunction to be resilient. I mean, and I'm trying to theorize what does that, I mean, and today we have heard about, I mean, Iona was, we are stretching ourselves, and then we had heard our other word like fugitivity, being on the run, exhausting oneself, and I'm trying here to identify what does it say that about the world that relates to Blackness as an injunction to stretch oneself, to run, to be fugitive all the time, and what does that generate for the world? That continuous injunction to be resilient. The origins of which are, by the way, uniquely, I would say, enslavement and not colonialism.
All right. I think with that, we have come to the end of what I think is a stimulating afternoon panel. And I want to thank all my panelists, particularly Lauren Landau, who is somewhere in the UK at around 11 p.m. or if not later. So I want to thank him for being so patient. Thank you, everybody, and I look forward to the next panel.